So, hi everyone. Thank you for attending the webinar, and thank you for NEQAS LI for inviting me to present a project that we conducted from the Clinical Immunology Service at the University of Birmingham. And today I'll be discussing the concept of creating a UK flow consortium and the harmonization of lymphoproliferative disorder or LPD panels and beyond. And as mentioned, I'm a hematology consultant at UHCW. I'm fairly new to flow reporting, and I'm sure there are many that are attending the webinar who have a breadth of experience with the topics I'll be discussing today. And I would really welcome your input in the discussion. So this project was conducted by myself and Professor Freeman at the Clinical Immunology Service at the University of Birmingham in the West Midlands in the UK. And it originally began when our flow lab was changing cytometers and had the option of additional colors. So the aim of our project was to understand the composition of flow labs used for LPD diagnosis throughout the UK in NHS labs and hopefully build on our existing panel. And actually, what we found was that there was a great degree of heterogeneity between the UK flow labs, but there were many similarities as well with regards to common markers used for the diagnosis, but also a small amount of useful uncommon markers used by specialized labs. And the result of the project was disseminated to the participating flow labs in a virtual meeting. And it provoked a lot of discussion in many areas of immunophenotypic diagnosis of LPD. And it was evident that there was a lot of enthusiasm to share results and develop the project further to include panels for, say, myeloid disorders as well. And ultimately, that is the vision, the creation of a UK flow network to facilitate the consensus of key markers required for the diagnosis of a variety of hematological disorders, but also to share best practice. So this is what I'll be talking you through today. So with regards to the methodology, we initially reached out to a variety of UK labs and NHS labs to participate in the project. And for each participating lab, we asked them to send their LPD panels. So we wanted to know, are they using a screening tube and what is the composition of their B and T LPD panel? And then with these results, we then asked the participating labs to rate the utility of each cell marker. So for example, CD49D, did they use it and how helpful was it? The results were then disseminated to all participants in the form of 2 roundtable discussions that were held virtually. And subsequently, a 2-round Delphi poll scoring method was used to then generate a consensus amongst participants for what they felt were the mandatory and recommended markers for B and T LPD diagnosis. And we also compared this data to anonymized NEQAS data that we obtained. So now I will discuss the results with you. And I would like to begin by thanking the participants in the project who probably were very patient with me when I was sending them so many emails regarding surveys. And the participants are listed in the slide. And some of them will have joined the session today. So a big thank you to you. We had excellent participation from England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Irish flow labs. And without their enthusiasm and motivation, we wouldn't have been able to present this project. So big thank you. And the participants ranged from clinical, laboratory scientists, and hematologists. And I'd also like to thank UK NEQAS LI for inviting me to give the webinar, and they also really helped with this project. And also thank you to Professor Freeman for mentoring me throughout the process, and also other reporting hematologists in our flow lab. So just a caveat for this presentation, there's quite a few graphs with lots of small numbers, which I've expanded into tables as well, just to go through the results with you. So we asked initially, so we had 14 labs participate in this, all of them within the UK, all NHS labs. And 14 of these labs out of 17 used a screening tube in their panel. And so what we wanted to know was, well, what is the composition of this. And as you can see, we've got some very common ones that you can see that, all labs, if not all labs, are using them. But then as we get down to sort of the smaller numbers, there are some that are uncommon. And that's probably because we are including quite specialist labs as well. So because this graph shows very small numbers, I just thought I would expand it. So you've got the cell marker there, which is on the left, and then you've got the number of labs using that cell marker. So between 14 to 1 on the right. So for the cell markers that were used uncommonly, so by less than 7 of the labs, I've just thought I would summarize some of the cell markers used just to expand on them and their utility. And I don't think there's many surprises. We know that screening tubes are quite useful just to guide what further investigations need to be done. So this just shows what the utility of some of the cell markers are. So now I'll discuss the BLPD results. So again, a big graph that's coming up. And just to reiterate, we weren't looking at plasma cell diagnosis. We were excluding the plasma cell panels. And this is the results from the 17 labs for their BLPD panels. So again, I think here there aren't too many surprises. You can see that all labs are using the most common ones. So kappa lambda, 25, 23, 10, 103, 20, 19, 79B. But as we get lower, you can see that again, mainly the specialized labs are using some other ones. And what we wanted to define is, well, what is the utility of these less used markers and how useful do the labs find them? And so we reached out to the labs with another survey and asked them to rate the utility. So for example, CD305, do you use this marker in your lab? And if you do, why is it helpful and how often is it helpful? Just for us to gauge, why is it used and for what diagnosis? And I've also listed then some of the uncommon markers. Certainly there are some here as for me, who's a beginner in flow reporting, that wasn't aware of some of them, especially the ones down at the bottom. I think CD305 generated a lot of discussion because Flow Labs found that that was very helpful in CLL diagnosis and also in prognosis as well. We know that CD49D can also be a prognostic marker, but only 4 labs were using that. And that might indicate that, now that we've got good genetics to be able to risk stratify, it might not be as useful. And then we've also got ROR1, which is used in CLL. And then as we get down, there's quite a few cell markers. And I'd be really interested in those people that are attending the webinar, how useful they find these sort of markers such as CD95, 39, 196, 185 as well, and what their sort of experience has been with them. And so for those who might not be familiar with CD305, I've put some useful references. So CD305 is expressed in CLL, and patients that express for risk form of disease. And ROR1 is used mainly for MRD, and higher levels can indicate more aggressive disease. So now I thought I would go through the TLPD panel. And again, very similar. Sorry, there's a graph here with lots of little numbers, but I've tried to expand it on the tables as well. And I would say once again, common markers are used by the majority of the labs, but there is a lot of variation happening. And again, with the inclusion of specialized labs, we are seeing some, very uncommon markers being used. And so again, we asked labs to tell us how useful they found them. So especially for the more uncommon ones, how often were they good at making a diagnosis? And if they'd previously used them but don't use them now, why is that? And again, I've included a table that just summarizes some of the uncommon T cell markers and what they might be used for. I mean, there's a lot of specialized ones, but I think for me, mainly the TRBC1 was one that was quite useful as it can detect aberrant clonal T cell populations. So I thought that that was a really useful one, and that generated quite a lot of discussion about its utility because we don't use that in our labs. And again, I'd be interested to know for the labs that do use this marker in their TLPD panel, how useful they would find it. And so TRBC1 is the T cell receptor beta constant region 1. And so the usage of TRBC1 and 2 domains are during the TCR alpha beta gene arrangement, which is a random and mutually exclusive process. And I would classify it similar to kappa and lambda immunoglobulin light chain utilization by B cells. And so normal TCR alpha beta T cell populations are expected to exhibit sort of comparable numbers of TRBC1 and TRBC2 positive subsets. So if you have clonality, so here is an example with Sézary, you get skewing. So you either get only TRBC1 positive or negative. So very, very similar to that sort of light chain restriction. And this was something quite new to me, which I found very helpful. So again, would be really useful to know what other centers' experiences in this. And so I thought I would go through the Delphi poll that we did, because again, this was a research method that was quite new to me. And essentially, a Delphi method is a structured communication technique that can be used to help reach an expert consensus and also develop professional guidelines. So it has been used in quite a few guidelines, and it involves quite a few fluid steps. And lots of surveys. So essentially, when you do a Delphi poll, you're initially defining a problem, so or a goal. So for us, it was what is the composition of these labs initially, but then it went into, well, what would we classify as mandatory cell markers for B and TLPD diagnosis? Thereafter, you want to engage experts, and that was our lab participants, and develop statements from them on what they think are the key markers for diagnosis. And then it involves dissemination of results, amplifying with peers, testing different strategies, analyzing the results, and then hopefully providing a consensus. So we did 2 rounds of the Delphi poll. And again, very grateful to the participants for letting me send them so many surveys. And so this is a horrible slide, but it's mainly meant to show that we asked the participants to rate each of the B and the T cell markers as if they would classify them as mandatory, recommended for subtyping, and not recommended. And then we went back and almost did the exact same again after we disseminated some of the results. And again, a difficult slide to look at, but what I wanted to emphasize is that the mandatory ones, a lot of labs agreed with. And again, similar for recommended for subtyping and similar for not recommended. But I thought it would be interesting just to show between 10 to 40% of the labs found these cell markers that I've listed on this table as mandatory for a BLPD diagnosis, which I found quite interesting. And then similar for the TLPD. So again, all of the cell markers, we asked them to rate as whether they felt they were mandatory, recommended for subtyping, and not recommended. And again, I would say there are quite a few similarities. A lot of labs agreed that they should be mandatory, and similar for recommended for subtyping and not recommended. And here again, I thought I would highlight for our TLPD panel, between 10 to 40% of labs felt that these markers in the table listed are mandatory for a TLPD panel. And again, would be grateful to hear your thoughts on what you think of this. And then finally, we then asked individuals again to whether they would agree with a mandatory or recommended for subtyping statement. So again, a nice poll was done that was sent to our participants. And it was from this that we were able to create a consensus that told us what labs, UK flow labs that we included, thought was mandatory and recommended for T and LPD diagnosis. And here are the results of the consensus. So I'll leave the slide up for a little bit just so that you can see. So we classified a cell marker as mandatory if greater than 75% of the labs voted it as mandatory. So I don't think there's too many surprises in this, actually. I think it's pretty obvious. And I think a lot of the labs will do this as part of their mandatory BLPD panel. And then I'll show you the recommended. And this is, so these are the cell markers that are recommended for subtyping in BLPD. And the way that we classified them as recommended would be that if 75% of labs recommended them as recommended for subtyping, or if the total score or percentage of mandatory and recommended was greater than 75%. So again, I'll just leave this here for you to look at. And this is what they would say recommended for BLPD diagnosis. And again, I would welcome your thoughts on that. So now going to the TLPD in a similar format. This is just, so this is just showing a summary of them, but also just to show that this was our anonymized NEQAS data that we obtained. And the reason I've put this up is just to show, so participating flow labs were sent CLL and mantle cell samples. And these were the results that we had. And so there were actually 44 labs that participated in the CLL sample and 43 for the mantle cell. And I've put in red the ones that our Delphi poll classified as mandatory, and the ones in blue that were classified as recommended for subtyping for these samples. Again, not too dissimilar, I don't think, from what we reached in our consensus. And now going on to the TLPD mandatory cell markers. So again, I don't think that there is much of a surprise in what labs would classify as mandatory for a TLPD panel. And we used a similar cutoff. So you had each cell marker had to have been voted by 75% or more of the labs to be voted as mandatory. And then this is the one recommended for subtyping. And I guess, again, would be interested to hear others' thoughts on this. So we used a similar scoring strategy. So to be a recommended cell marker, it had to score 75% or greater, or the combined score of mandatory and recommended to be 75% or greater. And I think, TRBC1 has crept up again, that 80% of the labs felt that this was a cell marker that should be used and is recommended for subtyping. So I'll just leave that there just for you all to see. And then, so in summary, so sorry, that was a bit of a quick tour through the project, but essentially, again, a big thank you to all of those that participated. And I think it has provided hopefully a valuable insight, just looking at sort of real world UK NHS practice. And I don't think there have been many projects like this. And I guess it highlighted that there is a lot of commonality between the flow labs, but there are some differences. And what I found, and hopefully the participants found, is that it was nice to have that networking between flow labs because there was a real enthusiasm for this, with scope to expand this and do similar polls and generate consensus for, say, myeloid panels, and also recruiting other UK flow labs. Um, We've also presented this to the Laboratory Specialist Interest Group at the British Society of Haematology. But ultimately, the aim would be to have that sort of UK clinical flow consortium that would enable future collaborative work, help with complex cases, education, sharing best practice, enabling further research, but also just engaging specialist labs, learning from them, and recruiting satellite labs as well through the UK. And that's it from me. So thank you so much for listening. And would be really interested to hear your inputs and experiences with some of the cell markers that I've discussed today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Qureshi. I'm sure everyone will agree that that was a superb and very thought-provoking talk. So you've got your camera on now, and I'm going to have a look at the questions that have been asked today. So if you could help us with answering those. To participants, you've got the chat function, the question and answer box, so there's still opportunity to put your questions in there. So the first question that I've got, Dr. Qureshi, is, have you got any plans to assess the impact of using different clones and fluorophores? And this is from an anonymous attendee.
Where is that question, Sam? Sorry, just so I can read it as well.
It's in the question and answer chat box.
Oh, yeah. And what was the question? Sorry, I can't see it there.
So if on the question chat, if you open the question and answer box,
oh, yeah, yeah,
you have the option to select the most upvotes,
yeah.
and it's the top one. It's from an anonymous attendee, so they want to know whether you
Oh, yeah.
plans to assess the impact of using different clones and fluorophores.
I don't think me personally, but I don't know if Professor Freeman is on the call and whether you could comment on that, Sylvie.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question, and I think that would be the next stage. I think the aim of this was to get commonality in markers. Obviously, fluorochromes and well, particularly fluorochromes will depend on the different cytometers in use. But it may be good to build up a library for people to know what other labs have found most performing with their different cytometers.
Thank
Thank you.
you.
I can see the questions now, Sam, actually. Sorry.
That's fine. So I'll go on to the next question that's on the list. So the one that's got the most votes now, it says, given that leukemia panel design ties into so many issues such as local knowledge, instrumentation, supplier contracts, is it possible to achieve a full harmonization in leukemia testing? Or do you think a minimum level of testing agreement is more feasible? And this is from an anonymous attendee.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think probably a minimal level of testing agreement is probably more feasible. Sylvie, would you agree, given how many issues there can be with harmonizing?
Yes, I mean, I think every lab will have, particularly the specialist labs, as you've illustrated in your survey and Delphi poll, have experience from having a lot of samples from one particular disease type, and it's probably unfeasible for us all to adopt the markers that they would find of added value because of their huge experience. But I think if we can get at least how we would classify as sort of mandatory and recommended, and people can adopt those when they're updating to their new panels.
Thank you.
Thank you both. So the next question on the list is, what is preventing the adoption of TCR-BC1 by more labs? I find it extremely useful. And this is from Elizabeth Michelle.
And I wonder if Elizabeth is from an NHS lab, but I think a lot of it is probably to do with quality assurance as well. Would you agree, Sylvie? Because we haven't adopted it yet in our lab, have we?
Yeah, I mean, it's very clear from this survey and from the experience how useful it is. I think there's just a delay for labs to have to sort of verify and validate new panels and put in new markers. But I think it's a clear front runner, isn't it, from our survey?
Yeah.
Thank you. Moving on to the next question. This is from Dave Bloxham. It's important to note that it's not that particular antigens need to be used and viewed in particular combinations to be most informative. Do you think it would be useful to also recommend particular analysis templates?
Good question from Dave.
Yeah.
I don't know. Obviously, you can't speak, can you, Dave? But again, that would be, you've been part of these discussions, and I think that would be a really good next step for this network.
Thank you. So moving on to another question, this time is from an anonymous attendee. Did the participants in the study have any discussions about choice of fluorochromes used and whether undertaking 6, 8, 10 colors and etc.?
I think that's a really good discussion for when we have that sort of networking meeting. We really did focus much more on the composition of the panels and the cell markers. Would you agree, Sylvie? I think that's a wider project, I guess. Yeah.
Thank you. And the next question from an anonymous attendee. Rita, would you recommend the use of the Delphi poll in future projects such as this?
I had never used a Delphi poll before. And so it was really interesting to see how a consensus was being formed. It's a bit tricky to do almost virtually and through email. So again, huge thank you to all of those who didn't get tired of all my emails, but I think it'd be interesting to do it more face to face in a meeting setting. Would you agree, Sylvie? Because I know you've done Delphi polls before.
I think as part of the process were the two sort of virtual face to face meetings, which was very important in informing the consensus. So yeah, no, absolutely. I think it's the best way to guide expert recommendations.
Yeah, and I can imagine we could use it in future meetings when we've got a lot of the people there. And I think just a point, because I can see there is another question. I don't know, and it's from Tom Butler, about how many labs didn't participate. So when we asked for participants, it really was almost sort of word of mouth and what contacts we had, and appreciating that, you know, that the labs are incredibly busy. So I would say I'm not entirely sure how many UK flow labs we have. And I guess, Sam, I don't know if you would know the answer, but in terms of the NEQAS LI data we obtained, it said 44 labs. And I wonder if that's incorporating private labs, not just within the UK as well. But it would be really great to have more people participating in this project.
Yes, so Iman, I'll jump in on that. So the numbers I sent you was the UK labs participating in it at the time. Not many private labs in it. I think they're mostly NHS labs that are in the program. So moving on to another question from anonymous attendee, says Euroflow has performed and published work on panels. Are you liaising with this group?
We did not, only because we just wanted to get just that sort of real world data from the UK labs themselves within the NHS. But that's a really good point and something we could look to in the future. Would you agree, Sylvie?
Yeah, I mean, as you say, man, this was the real world experience of what was happening in the UK NHS network, which is probably not dissimilar to real world experience in other countries as well.
Thank you both. And another question from an anonymous attendee. Are there any plans for expansion to myeloid panels, and how would lab express interest in participating?
Oh, yes, there is an interest. I think, Sylvie, that this is the plan. In terms of how labs can express interest, so we are looking. I mean, Sylvie, from your side, are we still sort of? It's more of a UK NHS labs. Would you agree that we would want to ask? And
Yes, at the moment we'd be focusing on the UK, but I don't know where the questioner comes from the UK. I mean, obviously, a larger survey would have to involve a lot more centres to become representative. But yeah.
Mm-hmm. And actually, because a lot of it was just trying to obtain contact details, and you know, again, that real number of how many UK flow labs there are. I know that Sam, Liam, and yourselves did send out a comms just about anyone that wanted to participate, but I might sort of discuss with you about how, if there are additional UK flow labs that do want to participate, and I can provide my contact details to them.
Yeah, we can certainly have a look at that. Thank you.
Thank you.
So moving on to the next question from Kaylee May. Yeah, she's curious what the utility of HLA-DR in a TLPD panel is. If just an activation marker, can we do without if an aberrant phenotype is found?
Sylvie, what do you think to that question?
I don't think HLA-DR wasn't on the consensus list, was it?
No. It was mainly on sort of, it was in someone's TLPD panel, so that's why it was.
So I think that probably answers the question, is for a sort of, on the mandatory and recommended list, it wasn't thought to be by itself or as useful.
Thank you. And a question from Ellen Freud. Are any labs working on 10, 12 color panels? I'm not sure if your survey captured this, but that's the question.
No, interesting question again, and these are very helpful because it will give us a lot of things to talk about in these meetings. But no, we didn't really ask specifically about the colors and how many they had.
Thank you. So moving on to the next question from an anonymous attendee. Can you see this work leading to guideline publication?
Yes, I guess so. And Sylvia, I know we've had discussions about
Yeah,
this.
so
What would be your
yeah.
thoughts
So you've
on?
already published it as an abstract at BSH. I think
Yeah.
I think between us, we would like with the help with and we've had say Tom Butler asked a question. I think he may have another comment about this, but we're hoping to form the network potentially with the BSH, and then we could discuss in that framework and whether that it forms part of the next guidelines as well for flow cytometry and hematoma malignancies.
Thank you. And I think you may have touched on this question just briefly from an anonymous attendee. This is real-world NHS UK data. Have you had any thoughts on expanding this to look at Europe/rest of the world?
Yes, that sounds like a lot of hard work, but yes, I guess we focus initially on just recruiting as many of the UK flow labs as possible, but it is very interesting, um, just seeing what all labs are doing. But yeah, something to bear in mind.
Thank you. So there's a question from Ethalia Yanaki. I'm not sure if it's quite typo, so we give up.
Giving, yeah, so
a acute BCL score or add more markers to enhance it.
Sylvie, what do you think to that in terms
Yeah,
of the
I'd leave that to the CLL experts. Our survey is just reflecting what's what the consensus is. I would not dare to comment on that.
Thank you. Right, so going through the questions. So there's another question from an anonymous attendee. Anonymous attendees are quite busy this afternoon. Have you compared the panels used to established panels from commercial manufacturers?
No. But again, something anonymous attendee for us to really think about in our future meetings as well.
Thank you. And another question.
And I can
the harmonization of panels is great, but my feeling is that harmonization of analysis would be more beneficial as we can't get agreement on classifying weak, moderate, or strong expression.
Yeah, it is interesting, isn't it, about the classification or the difference in classification between expression and this is something that we've discussed a lot for in the field of MRD. There is one particular useful publication that we use which classifies as weak and heterogeneous, but I think this would be another on the growing list of topics to add for network discussion, get consensus and all speak the same language.
Thank you. Another question from Dave Luxem. It reads, the list of recommended antigens for detection is very long, and my guess is that the majority of cases would not require the full panel, example CD30. Bearing in mind the cost of carrying the full repertoire, do you think there is a place for the creation of reference labs that would have the full repertoire?
Yeah, I agree with you, Dave. That is quite interesting. Especially the cost. I don't know, Sylvia, would you agree with that? Having these sort of reference labs?
Yeah, I mean, yes, I think because labs have to make individual decisions about how many antibodies they have in their panel and the duration they have their premixes. So there's certainly a strong argument for high throughput, a reference network.
Thank you. And I think we've got one question from an anonymous attendee. What is the useful publication that you use to classify expression, Sylvie? I think you mentioned that in your answer.
Yeah, it's actually a paper that was by Michael Forzak, which was specifically for BALL. but they had a very nice figure which showed strong, how they classified strong, weak / heterogeneous and negative. I can't remember the exact reference, but I could circulate it back to you, so for you to circulate to the participants.
Thank you, Sylvie. So I'll jump in on that actually. So that's actually the reference paper that we include in the Leukemia Immunophenotyping.
Oh, well, you're a step.
So for any participants that want to access that paper, just go to, if you're registered in the Leukemia Immunophenotyping Part 1 report, go to the bottom at the reference section and you should find the reference in that section.